Today on the podcast, we have Anne Ocampo and Dennis Piper from Sasaki. Sasaki is an interdisciplinary architecture, planning, landscape, and design firm with offices in Boston, Denver, New York, and Shanghai. The firm is known for blending disciplines, engaging with clients and communities, drawing on history and context, and using data and emerging technologies to shape the built environment. Anne Ocampo is a principal at Sasaki and an associate professor of the practice of urban design and planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She practices as an urban designer, working on international and domestic institutional and urban projects and cultural identity, leading teams with strategic planning and a commitment to design excellence. Anne's design work has been recognized with many awards, among which by the American Institute of Architects, for her contributions to urban design thinking as a recipient of the 2016 National Associates Award, the highest honor given to individual associate AIA members. Dennis Piper plays a leading role in the planning and urban design practice of Sasaki. His 35 years of both national and international experience encompass diverse project types including urban districts, new communities, campus environments, waterfronts, and urban regeneration. Through his design practice, Dennis focuses on strategic thinking and creating value for clients, stakeholders, and communities. He approaches his urban design work collaboratively, integrating landscape, planning, and architecture with a critical understanding of the forces that shape contemporary cities. At the Harvard Graduate School of Design, Dennis has taught in the Professional Development Program and co-led a studio focused on Boston Innovation District. Enjoy! Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Anne Ocampo and Dennis Piper. You're both principal urban designers at Sasaki. Anne, Dennis, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
So please tell us more about yourselves, your own personal backgrounds, how you came to where you are today, and then maybe a little bit more on Sasaki. Whoever would like to go first.
Anne.
Well, thank you, Dennis. Hi, everyone. My name is Anne Ocampo, and I am an urban designer at Sasaki, and I have also been a teacher. I'm an associate professor at MIT, where I teach in the School of Architecture and Planning, and really get to merge the integration of design and planning into the way that I think about cities and institutions and neighborhoods. I am delighted to be here. My background is really through architectural design, where I studied as an undergraduate student at the University of Kentucky and at Cornell, and then went on to do planning and urban design at Harvard before I came to Sasaki.
Thank you. Dennis?
And I'm also a principal at Sasaki, focused on urban design. And I too came to urban design through architecture. I was born in South Africa, but I left when I was a teenager to go study architecture at the University of Toronto. And it was an amazing experience. I just transformed my life. Best decision I ever made. And I went on to do a master's in urban design at Harvard, same program as Anne. And I joined Sasaki shortly after graduating. So it's quite a while ago. And I've worked over the years on many kinds of projects. I tend to work on a lot of international projects, but also across the US and North America. And Anne and I have collaborated on a number of projects. We're collaborating now, and it's been an amazing experience at Sasaki and continues to be.
Yeah, and I mean, we're big fans. So would you like to talk a little bit more about Sasaki for our audience as well? You're quite an interdisciplinary studio, so we would love to hear, I guess, your overall ethos and approach in projects.
Dennis, why don't you start this time? Yeah.
One of the things that attracted me to Sasaki was this broad array of lenses through which the firm looks at projects, opportunities, and conditions. It was really like a new education for me, because I got exposed to landscape architects, to ecologists, planners, technologists, others interested in the same things that I was interested in, or very different things. And so it was all about learning. And the firm was founded by Hideo Sasaki in the early 50s. He was an American-born of Japanese heritage. He was born in California, and he spent the war years in an internment camp with his family. And he was a very smart fellow. And at the end of the war, he went on to study landscape architecture, I believe in Illinois, and then at MIT, and eventually became the head of the landscape department at Harvard University. And in the early 50s, when CERT was there, and in that era, they realized the world was very different. Problems were very complex. They couldn't be dealt with by single disciplines. And so in 1953, he founded Sasaki as this interdisciplinary practice. Really, his students at Harvard, mainly, he drew on them. And he invented this firm and went on to great success on a whole array of projects all across the country. And we continue to thrive today. And I don't know, Marianne, if you want to add more, I'm sure you have.
No, that's great. I think Dennis has a great sense of the history of the firm, having been the previous president. And so I think that that history is so rich. When I joined the firm, about 12 years ago, it was what I found to be so fascinating is just the immense kind of energy of questioning and being curious about the world and excited and inspired by how we think about the built environment. And so the interdisciplinary dialogues and debates that we have as part of our creative process, really thinking about different scales of understanding rural areas to cities, and how we can do it through landscape planning and urban design and architecture, but also through technology with our Sasaki Strategies group. We have a robust kind of ecosystem of folks who are willing to test and experiment and question things that makes it so rich as far as the way that we work and our processes with the firm. So I think that in the last, kind of couple of decades, we've been, it's always been evolving. And so we're always never staying too still. We're always questioning and thinking about, how are we seeing the world today, and how can we learn from the kind of changes and movements and needs that are happening, and how do we go about, what's our role in contributing to how we design and plan for that world. So I think that's what I love about, the culture of Sasaki, is the perpetual kind of questioning and curiosity of thinking about how we improve our processes of working with clients and communities.
I mean, I love this, and I'm so fascinated by it too, because I feel like, at the year of like 2022, we still find ourselves, sometimes trying to even educate on the fact that because we live in such a complex world now, and, it started way back then, if anything, it's just getting more and more complex, right? Even like in consideration with like systems theory, like how we need to approach this and how experimentation and this interdisciplinary collaboration matters so much. And it's not even like a nice to have, it's merely a survival strategy at this point, right? But I'm so fascinated that you guys are already, you know, in 1950s, like recognizing that this is the direction that needs to be taken, and then really starting to practice that. Because sometimes, you know, as a relatively much younger firm, we feel it's still like there's a lot of education that goes on and trying to explain why such practices matter, and really pushing the boundaries so early on to not just, you know, of course, interdisciplinary is very fun, but not just like having fun with work, but really showing why it matters and why such approach is very, very necessary to be able to tackle, if we want to tackle any challenge in the world. I think it's very naive to assume that we can handle, like we can solve problems by ourselves. So that collaborative approach and attitude, and pushing to get outside of our silos, right? Which I think exists a little bit in our domain. I don't want to say like maybe urban design, and I would love to get your thoughts on this too, because I feel that's like one of the maybe the problems that we have a little bit in our industry, where I think urban design has an understanding of like the collective systems of things, because it's more like recognizing all the things that needs to happen for a city. But in architecture, for example, we sometimes don't see enough collaboration, and we wonder why. And why aren't different communities engaged in collaboration? Why are the collaboration that how we define it is more, you know, in certain professions that are more traditionally needed to realize an architectural project? And how can we kind of slowly move beyond that? I would love to have your take on like how you saw this evolved over time a little bit, or if it evolved. And if you are seeing, and I'm sure like I think we're becoming more and more collaborative again, because by no choice, but how did you see this like evolve, I guess, over time in our own disciplines?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's a big debate about, is urban design a discipline? And I like to think of it as a way of thinking, because it draws from the expertise and knowledge and creativity from so many different parts, whether it's ecological or social or economic or formal, you know, urban form, history, context, culture. It's really a synthesizer and a way of thinking about systems, about invention, and in terms of, you know, who is the client. I remember when I studied at Harvard, that was sort of a really, it opened my eyes when we were discussing in almost our first week at GSD around the challenge of urban design. Always, who is the client? Who are the stakeholders here? And you know, if I have to say, one of the sort of most important aspects of our work in the last while has been engagement and understanding and listening more. And, you know, in our international practice, some cultures are not as open to that process than we are in the United States and elsewhere. So, you know, that is a very significant evolution of our practice.
And I would say that I think that urban design, it's complex in the sense that, as I think Dennis has mentioned, there are different philosophies, and that's what makes it so interesting to understand what your personal theory to practice in urban design is. And I think that we've seen different ways that we can approach urban design historically. And so I think, you know, what is that to how we practice or how I practice? And I think ultimately, as in agreeing with Dennis about synthesizing complex systems into meaningful kind of impacts. And I think that a lot of the time understanding, again, across different scales of thinking, also across different times, periods of times and scales of time become very important in the way that we think about design. But the engagement process, meaningful, active engagement, and what that means as far as designing together is definitely evolving in the way that we've looked at design in the last 50 years. And so I think that, collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration is crucial for urban design. I think it is plural. I go by the philosophy of Brent Ryan, who wrote a wonderful book, The Largest Art, talking about urban design as a manifesto of thinking about plural, ways that we understand buildings, landscapes, infrastructures, ownership, and different approaches to how we can design incrementally over time with this notion of incompleteness. It's never finite. It will always be something that is changing and evolving. And so that you're just part of that one little blip of time and thinking about the city or a town or a neighborhood, but understanding who's empowered and that kind of way of deciding what is happening in their own neighborhoods or cities, and how you are part of those discussions that are helping envision what that future can be. And so I think there's different roles of urban designers and based off their different philosophies. And so I think we have to be really aware of that. I also think that interdisciplinary collaboration can be super fun. It could also be great because it requires rigorous debate about what you prioritize. And that becomes something where I think we can have tremendous value in understanding how you're negotiating between different systems that you have to prioritize and different motivations by different community members and stakeholders. So how does that work within a system where you have to synthesize, but you have to be prioritizing with others what the drivers are as part of those projects? And there is skills that have to be used in that regard. So I think it is a way of thinking. I do think that there are a lot of ways that we can see it as a discipline as well, urban design.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many beautiful things you all mentioned. Well, first of all, I love the definition of the synthesizer because, synthesis is such an important, if not like one of the most important aspects of the design process, right? And I feel like we do not achieve authentic outcomes when we skip that part, when we rush the exploration and we try to like move on to design right away, right? But that like achieving synthesis really is not only creating better outcomes, but also very necessary to understand the roadmap, like what's next. To your point, being able to achieve that flexibility and adaptability in order to really continue to evolve, because I think in nothing that we do in the world, it's a one and done, right? We got it right, we did it. And especially when you're trying to look at things that are inclusive, sustainable, right? You will never achieve it at one point. You will always like look into how can you continue to iterate, how do you expand, how does it evolve? So I think, in urban design, maybe because it's already by nature so interdisciplinary and vast, like the largest artwork you were mentioning, there is more understanding of that, because I feel like, placemaking, for example, is a concept in urban design, but we don't necessarily have that understanding in product design, right? Like we really want to get it right when it's out there, where you're also like, but products evolve, everything evolves. And I think that understanding, like being comfortable with that, that also, in my mind, kind of puts an urban designer in a role of almost like a conductor, like really both synthesizing but facilitating, really making sure this approach, mindset, and attitude is adapted by the bigger team, so that it's carried on later. So in that way, I do feel like it's definitely a discipline, right? Because you need that role of being able to bring all parties together for everyone to be their best versions, right? So in that sense too, it's a beautiful role, and I think it's almost the most ripe to collaborate. And I think we all, like all designers in diverse fields, can learn a lot from urban designers. That's at least how I feel as someone who came into the design world as an outsider. My background is in engineering, and that's what, like, I felt the most human field in design felt like urban design, even though it's so big, right? Like, I would think maybe it's like products because it's closer to humans, but urban felt more human. And I think it's because of that kind of role that brings everything together, or, you know, in good urban design practice, at least. Because I just went to the theater, Straight Line Crazy. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's about Robert Moses. So it's
Oh,
like
yeah.
talks about that.
Reading
So
about it.
it's at the Shed. Yeah, it's live now in New York City. So I was just at that like 2 weeks ago. And so there's a moment where you're kind of, okay, so there's planning and design, and there's planning and design. So like, how can something go wrong and go right? Like, it was a great, I guess, like a quick study of that.
You know,
So
one of the if I think about an example of this way of thinking, it is at Sasaki, we've kind of shifted away from the notion of master planning, which is a traditional way of thinking about urban scale issues. We like to think of urban design as frameworks for urbanism at different scales. And that works at a regional scale and at a district scale or a site scale. But what it does is it addresses the points that Marianne made, which have to do with evolving over time, decisions that are expanding and not narrowing down. The process of evolution and growth needs to be flexible. It needs to be open and inclusive. And so the idea of framework is, what is the essence of a place? At Sasaki, we like to think of urban design as being about a framework. And at Sasaki, it's often driven by an approach to landscape and ecology. These are the sort of initial drivers of a big idea. And we draw in all the other components that we've been talking about, whether they're social or programmatic or economic or, you know, all the kind of elements of urban design that we try to synthesize. So it's a way of thinking that's broad and inclusive. You know, Marianne and I worked together on a project for Syracuse University, and I was thinking, you know, we began that by trying to understand the kind of civic structure of the place that needed to be made stronger, and its engagement with the city and its neighbors, and how could that drive future growth and evolution of the campus. And it was through that way of thinking that we began to evolve the program, the public realm, the desired growth of the university by leadership and the community. So framework is a kind of critical way of thinking for us.
And I would just add, you know, with that plan for the Syracuse campus framework plan, it was very much so that we talked about the terminology of why framework, what does that mean, and how does that distinguish itself from a master plan, of which we had found previous planning efforts where there was these gorgeous drawings of works of architecture for the whole campus, and very quickly became outdated, because if we think about the scale of time, and again, the idea that we don't know everything at that one period of time and that it will change, we have to create a physical framework that has a vision, that has that flexibility of forces we don't know are going to be part of our future. And how would we create enough of a resilient civic realm and public realm that no matter what the forces are, there are these larger organizational structures that we want to really highlight and prioritize. But there are other pieces of the physical campus that can change and adapt. But there are certain things that perhaps should be strengthened and that are a little bit more prioritized as that organizational structure. And so I think that has been something that has been wonderful to see over the last 8 years, really be part of a guiding decision-making process for the physical kind of environment, and then understand how things are changing and seeing that it works as a framework plan, and it's successful because it can adapt without taking away or contradicting itself over time.
Yeah, I love that because it's almost like a strategic plan, right? But it's much more flexible because it's, in the end, if we want things to sustain, it has to work for all stakeholders and not only the people, but the planet as well. And we change, right? So if we just like acknowledge that from there, I think really creating a static image does not work. I mean, it's very clear that it doesn't work like right away. So in that sense, really helping clients build a roadmap through like frameworks and toolkits and guidelines seem much more reasonable, especially in the context that, like the complex context that we operate in the past and today as well. I would love to ask a little bit about, because, and that is one of the beauty and difficulty in like urban design too, because it's such a large scale, but it's also so human, right? So it requires this like constant exercise of zooming out and zooming in, having like a systems view, but also really understanding perspectives. And you did mention also we're listening more, right? So you're engaging communities. So how does that urban to human kind of exercise happen throughout the process?
Well, it's very much depends on the location of our work, and we try to gain a deep understanding of the cultural context. And there's different levels of engagement. Some projects have very intense and continuous engagement with stakeholders and people who will be affected by our work. Others are more episodic, and it's often driven by the client, but it's also often, especially in our international work, comes through our advocacy and our kind of way of thinking that suggests the importance of that aspect of the process.
And I would add, for some of our domestic work, we've been working at the University of Kentucky on a diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces plan that ultimately is looking at the scale of time to understand what the histories of the past have been that have created this place. So everything from understanding Indigenous presence of a site to the founding of the Moral Act of 1862 and the notion that Indigenous populations were impacted by the taking of land to finance a public university system of the land grant, to ways that we're thinking about redlining or campus expansion or enslaved labor that has built some of the kind of cities that we work in. And so across the country, I think that we're trying to understand the many different plural histories that have emerged and have created the kind of context that we work in today. And so there's a very human aspect to that of understanding what those impacts are, but we're also understanding that past, those larger systems and policies in place, and then thinking about through engagement, how that still impacts people today and what maybe there might be as barriers in the physical built environment that are posing problems to the way that people experience a place. And so I think that there's a way that we have to think of the macro and micro relative to time and space. And we have to ground truth that by having conversations and actively listening to those who are in some cases on the margins and are not part of a majority kind of identity group that are really affected by the decision making in the design of the built environment. And so that's one project that started to kind of move across different ways that we really go back to the past to understand what it is today and what it's going to be in the future about how we design that built environment and who's been left out of that process or impacted by decisions from the past. And so I think that the human-centric aspects of this are really in today's world, thinking about inclusion, justice, and equity in a way that we can respond by one, having conversations, two, by thinking about the built environment and its role in perpetuating, those barriers or solving so that they do not, that they create more inclusive environments. And then three, having ongoing dialogues with those who occupy and use those spaces and thinking about how we shape future policies and practices to design differently.
I love that. I mean, we always say historians should be part of every project in urban design and architecture, and it's definitely like having that understanding also is so important to the role that we were talking about, like synthesis, right? Not just looking at like today and zooming in on that, but really what from our past is influencing today as well, and therefore how can we synthesize both together and plan for the future, and also how we interpret our past too evolves, right? Speaking of like everything is changing, like how we synthesize and look at that, and the values, what is right, what is wrong, like everything kind of shifts like over time as well. So it's important, I guess, to highlight that too, going back to the part where you said it's like ongoing, because even if this study was done 5 years ago, understanding history doesn't mean that that is also static, right? Like that has to be an ongoing dialogue, and we need to continue to build that understanding of how does that history impact the present. I love how kind of that collective study, again, like very interdisciplinary, allows human-centeredness and like community-centeredness. I also want to highlight another project that we love, Ananas from Sasaki, which is also very much like having full understanding of a certain like profession too, and really being able to like address that as well. And in that case, like we're looking into like farmers, right? And could you please talk a little bit more about that project as well? And I think that's a great example of showing like how human-centeredness can also look like.
I mean, Ananas was a really interesting project for us, not only because of its location, but the client. The client came to us with a very innovative way of thinking. And they wanted to, they owned some land in the Metro Manila area, and they wanted to try something new. They wanted to go beyond the typical gated community approach, single purpose, just residential driven development. And they were intrigued by entwining a community with an agricultural production that made the land productive in a way that transcended urban development. And there was a strong demand for new housing, and there was a new road that was built right next to the site, or that was coming, that they wanted to plan for. And so we began again with a very ecological approach that looked at the existing site. There were ravines and really strong forces that would certainly influence the way we thought about it. And we wanted to really develop a new paradigm for living. How could you entwine urban agriculture, living, Philippine culture, community, work, recreation, and an openness to making a new community in the region. And so we had a lot of fun. It was a project that was interesting because this was like 2014. So quite a while ago. You see a lot of projects like that these days, but at that time, not really.
Yeah.
And, we had a thesis, sort of triggered by the client, but we had our own interest, and we wanted to invent something new that we could test with a client. And so it was just a lot of fun to develop an idea that transcended the usual way of doing things.
And I would just add, what was great was with that client relationship, it was designing with nature. So we had to really be present. Now, I'm a Filipina American, so for me to go back and visit family and to understand that culture with research that I've been doing, and then kind of going back and then being part of the project with Dennis and this wonderful team, we could be on the ground, understanding what that agricultural production was like, understanding that Metro Manila is the urbanization of Metro Manila and the growth projections and the population kind of projections. How can we start to think about these outer edges of Metro Manila and the way that we can think about an ungated community, but really a mixed use district neighborhood that was kind of looking back and reflecting on current development patterns that had emerged based off, a way of practicing and seeing the world, but how could we start to borrow from those, but also really rethink them? And how can we value the land, value the history of the land, value the people that took care of that land as part of our way of thinking about this mixed use kind of district neighborhood that's quite large, but also, having pollinator paths and a way to think about these larger kind of landscape systems that would help structure and organize the way we thought about this new community that would emerge. And so I think that what you'll find in that is a respect for the land, the water, the climate, the culture, and then finding ways that could grow over time and change over time, but also even looking at building typologies and understanding that there's a way that we can really highlight Filipino customs and rituals that would be interwoven into this place, which historically the Philippines has had a lot of different folks occupy it with Spanish colonization, Japanese occupation, the US. So how can we highlight Filipino native culture in a way that is part of this place and really celebrate it? And so I think that's, to me, what was so wonderful about this project was putting the Philippines kind of aspects into every way that we could think about the scales of details that we were designing with, working with the client.
I would add that a kind of sustainable approach was overriding in terms of how that would influence the urban form, thinking about ecology, thinking about how you respond to the monsoons and the unique local climatic condition, human comfort, and also socially. The land was formerly agriculture. It was failing. The word ananas comes from pineapple, which
Yeah.
is what was grown there. And our idea was, let's integrate some existing communities that were on the site into the larger framework. Perhaps the urban agriculture can provide jobs and knowledge exchange with the people on the site and those coming there. And so this idea of living in an environment where you could have access to agriculture and where there could be larger communal agricultural areas that would serve restaurants and supermarkets.
Yeah.
And, we even had a market area in the Central Park of ananas. So it really began to entwine the kind of social structure of the community and the urban form as well.
Yeah, it's a beautiful case study for just like a community building project, really, as well. Because, and to your point, at the time that this was done too, because now I think we're questioning more and more, and we see the problems that gated communities create in many developing countries, right? And I think we have more and more understanding towards that now, and how to like looking at ways to like how to undo the impacts of what happened. But I think for its time and how it was really understanding the local localities and really giving an opportunity for a community to be built and thrive. In that sense, we love that project so much. And I'm Turkish American. We call pineapple ananas too in Turkish, so it's that way too. I personally, I find the naming also beautiful. So I mean, we can talk about your projects a lot more, because we really love your approach. But I do want to ask to both of you, I guess, anyone who really wants to make change, make progress. I don't want to say make change, because as we all know, that doesn't happen easy, but push for progress and push boundaries in any field, in urban design and architecture and other design fields too. What would be your advice to them?
Marianne?
Well, let's see here. That's a great question. I feel like passion, stand with your convictions and learn and be curious about the world and how you can contribute to it. So what is your role within, design in a way that you can contribute to those conversations that you're passionate about, as far as what you think we need to progress in? So whether it's climate change, whether it's really thinking about equity and just cities, to how you want to think about, I don't know, ways that we're thinking about health and wellness today. I think that there's a role that we can play as designers. And I think that we have to figure out how to be part of those conversations and figure out ways that we can contribute. And I think that that's going to be learning from others and really listening to others and finding ways that we can spatialize and thinking about decision-making processes and actively engaging others.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And I would add, you have to learn to collaborate. An individual cannot solve problems on their own. And it's really about being curious, but being curious about your colleagues, the larger community where you're working, and recognizing that people need to work together, whether in a firm like Sasaki. I think Hideo Sasaki once said, collaboration is the only contribution. It was a great statement, because it suggested that great ideas can come from anywhere, from the youngest intern to the most experienced person in the firm. And we do that today. I mean, I can't tell you how much Marianne and I learn from our colleagues. We have a very diverse group of people at Sasaki from all over the world. I think they speak with 35 or 40 languages are spoken in Sasaki.
I love that.
Yeah. We celebrate Diwali and Chinese New Year and Passover and every kind of conceivable event. So that collaboration is great. And as Marianne said, ask for advice, draw from expertise that others have, and overall just be curious about as much as you can, and never stop being a student. It's always about learning more.
I love those, curiosity and collaboration. And I love it also because I feel like collaboration is such a loosely used term, but it's so powerful and meaningful, and it's a practice in itself too. So having that understanding at a younger age going into field, I think is very valuable. So thank you so much for all of this and sharing all your experience and history and projects at Sasaki too. We encourage all our audience to follow you guys if they're not already. And we look forward to seeing what type of projects you all bring to life.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.